Well, thank you for joining the inaugural podcast here. And as our first guest, we've got Len Hawkins. And if you recognize the last name, he would be my father. So we're very proud and happy to have you here today to kind of join us in the inaugural podcast. And I see you've got something up there on the left-hand corner. Didn't have that as my questions, but given it's there, I think we got to probably start with that. Tell us a little bit about the history of that well-worn jacket.
Well, seeing as this is an Aggie podcast, and we're having our 56th reunion this week from the University of Guelph, I got the old jacket out that I wore when I started going to the University of Guelph to see if it would fit, because I'm going to wear it to the reunion this week. And lo and behold, I can still get into it. So I thought I'd just hang it on the door for the interview this morning.
Very nice. Very nice. Now, does it fit snug? Or is it, did you need a shoehorn maybe?
Yeah, it's a little snug, but that's okay. I can at least still get into it. And I bet you very few people can, because I weigh about the same now as when I graduated.
It's been working out. Nice. Very good.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us. The essence of this podcast is try to interview as many people as we can to understand, obviously, the legacy that they and those they've worked with in agriculture are leaving and have left. So it's great to talk to you today. But I mean, when we talk about agriculture and talk about the Aggies, whether it's actually Guelph or just in Canada, tell us a little bit about where that passion for agriculture came from.
Well, the passion for agriculture probably came from being born on a farm in the 40s. And growing up on a farm and learning all the things you had to do on a farm. We had a mixed farm with some cattle and some hogs and some sheep, like a lot of people in those days. It was only 100 acres. And we grew grain and corn and hay, and that was a farm in those days. And it was a small community, and it was post-war era and post-depression era. And so everybody just wanted to learn how to feed themselves and build a little community that was free of all the stress they had gone through in the previous decade or two. And so in some ways it was a tough life, but in other ways it was an amazing life, because you learned how to get along with people. You learned how to deal with nature and everything around you. You had no fancy communication items to deal with, like a television, for example. We had a party line on the telephone with about 7 or 8 people. People didn't go more than 4 or 5 miles from home. The life of the community was the church and the local store and a community center if you're lucky enough to have it. So it was quite a different time, and I'm quite proud to have grown up in that environment.
Now, how does one take that, essentially no technology, etc., and I believe going to school at Anderson Corners, which was around 2 kilometers up the road, with every grade in the same room. How do you take that to ending up at a place like the University of Guelph?
Well, growing up, of course, you didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what you're going to do in the future when you're 8 or 10 years old. And you went to school every day. We didn't have a school bus. We walked to school or biked. And then eventually, of course, you go to the high school, and you go through the grades, and at some point you say, oh my gosh, pretty soon I'm going to be out of high school. What am I going to do? And the answer, well, go back to the farm, which is what a lot of people did. But I didn't really like that option, because I was tired of milking cows and doing all that hard work. And I didn't like hogs that well. I didn't like chickens that well. So I thought, well, there's got to be something better to do in life. So I just kept going. And eventually I decided, well, I'll see if I can get into the University of Guelph, because it's an agricultural college. And so I applied and get into the University of Guelph. And then eventually figured out what I wanted to do from there. I didn't take anything to do with crops. I took microbiology and chemistry, and then graduated. And I didn't really want to even go into the crop protection industry or the ag industry at all. I started off as a milk inspector with the dairy branch of the Department of Agriculture. But that only lasted 6 months until I couldn't handle the politics and moved on to the crop protection industry and spent the rest of my life in that area.
There you go. Well, I was going to get into that a little bit. I mean, tell the story about that. I know the story well, but talk about when you were working as a milk inspector and then why, like define the politics and what you mean behind that. It's a good story.
Well, it was in, we started off, first job offer I had at a university was actually to be a brewmaster in development in Montreal, because that fit the microbiology expertise fairly well. But we didn't want to move that far away, never been east of Toronto and couldn't speak French, so decided not to do that. But anyway, the dairy branch hired me, not knowing where I was going to be located. And we ended up in Alexandria in Glengarry County, which is right next to the Quebec border. A little town with 2,000 people, mostly French. And that's fine. But as we got going along in the job, about 6 months in, my boss calls me in and he says, we need to have a talk. He said, I've been going through all the call reports from all my staff, and you're making about 10 or 11 calls a day, and the rest of my staff's making 7 or 8. He said, you either got to take a longer lunch break, start later in the morning, or quit earlier at night. So I knew that that wasn't a career I wanted to pursue, where I had really no future. I had to work 5 or 6 hours a day, and that didn't really suit me. So I decided it was time to move on from there.
The old example of don't work too hard to make everyone else look silly. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So how did you parlay that? University of Guelph, originally went for microbiology, possibly being a brewmaster, then getting into the dairy industry, which was relevant to how you grew up, obviously with dairy on your farm, to then into crop protection in the chemical industry in the, I guess, late 60s, 70s.
Well, the crop protection industry was just in its infancy in that era. And there was an ad in the paper that I saw. It was Agro Spray Chemicals out of Tillsonburg. And they were looking for a sales rep east of Toronto. So I applied for the job and got it. We moved to Port Hope, and I had the territory, everything east of Toronto. And we sold mainly in the tobacco belt, but there was also a lot of new chemistry coming along, products like atrazine, which was a herbicide to control twitch grass in corn. It was just in its infancy in that era. And a lot of products at that time were just the hormone products like 2,4-D and MCPA that you spray on your cereal crops. But the other products that we sold were for tobacco, soil fumigants and sucker control products. And there was about 8,000 acres of tobacco in the Port Hope area, and we lived there. And mainly we sold direct to the farmer, because in those days there was really no distribution channel clearly defined. You either sold through farmer dealers or you sold direct to the farm, because the farm supply outlets, as we would know them today, that sell fertilizer and chemicals, etc., really weren't interested in crop protection products. They were more interested in learning the fertilizer business and expanding that, and they didn't really understand what was going on in the crop protection market. So that's how we got started.
Now, tell us a little bit about, because it was a different time. We've come a long way since the 70s, but if you've got any stories about the 70s, essentially, I know you worked at more than just one company, maybe a few of the how you transitioned from one company to another, really from the early 70s into the late 70s.
Well, it's been quite a transition, the whole crop protection area. Back in those days, there were, in the early 70s through the 70s, there was probably at its best about 100 different companies involved in the crop protection industry around the world. And they were consolidating rapidly as you got on into the 80s. In the 70s, it was just kind of, they were growing and growing rapidly with all new products, and kind of a little bit of consolidation at the end of the 70s, but more rapid on into the 80s. And, you know, for example, in Agro Spray Chemicals, we had 21 people when I worked for them. And I got Salesman of the Year award the second year I worked for them. And the third year, they cut their staff to 3 people. because they were being bought out. So he had to move on. And so at that time, they had a position in the paper looking for a technical sales rep for Fison's. And Fison's had the exclusive distribution of atrazine for the Ciba-Geigy company that manufactured it. And so I applied for that job, and we moved to Fergus. And I was a technical sales rep there for about a year. And then the sales position opened up in Perth and Huron County, which is where we were born and raised. And so I applied for that and got it, and then moved on from there. So it was always something to do with the consolidation that forced you to move, or you were moving to a different company because you wanted to move up the ladder in some respect. And I worked for 7 different companies. I've gone through 11 different acquisitions and mergers. So it isn't like you don't get used to it. And in that era, you really had to get used to defining what your next steps were and making sure you were a commodity that somebody wanted to hire.
Right. Well, maybe this is a good time, and I don't want to tell the whole story, but enough to get you going on it is there's the story about, because everyone switched sales jobs so many times, you guys essentially had road tours similar to bands back in the 50s, right? Where you'd have 3 or 4 artists going from community center to community center. But you did that in agriculture too in the 70s, early 80s, where everyone would get up and get their 15 minutes of fame. You know where I'm going here? Tell a story about when you guys got a little bored on the tour and what you do for fun.
Well, it was a wonderful era in that we had the transfer of technology was basically at the farm level. And everybody was hungry for knowledge because nobody really understood what this whole crop protection business was all about. And so you ended up doing a lot of grower meetings. And I mean, you do 2 or 3 a day from about the 1st of December through till about the middle of April. And that was a long grind. And you see the same people at every meeting giving the same presentation on behalf of their company. And so we get to the point where we're almost traveling together, and we did at times because we had joint meetings for the crop protection industry at the time to introduce the grower and dealer certification on behalf of the provincial government. And we did metrification when that was introduced. So we traveled together for those meetings around the country, and sometimes even for the grower and dealer meetings. And later on, when you get to about the 1st of April, and you've heard everybody's presentation about a dozen times, we decided, well, let's change it up and give a little freedom to this operation. And so we switch presentations and do the other guys, and they do ours. I mean, that is not taboo today. Now, we wouldn't do that with a big location where people really might know us.
Right.
We would switch it up someplace where we're in a country or a part of the country where people didn't really know us very well or know the companies very well, just to add a little entertainment value.
Just to keep it fun. Well, it's amazing you knew it. Well, they always say, you got to know your competitors' products as well as you know yourselves. So I guess you lived up to that, right? So as you're progressing through your career there, you're a rep for a while. How and when, because I know you've said that Stauffer was likely your favorite time of your career, at least that point, at least in the crop protection side of things. So tell us a little bit about how that came to be, Stauffer, and then where they came from, and then consolidation, where they went after that.
Well, the job with Fison's was a great job, and I really enjoyed that because I had a great boss, and I learned a lot from him and the people I worked with. But then Fison's lost the exclusive distribution for atrazine from Ciba-Geigy. They took it back to distribute it themselves. So the Fison's company went out of business basically in North America. So then it was a matter of moving on from there. And I went to work with Pfizer Chemicals as a distributor for a short period of time back in my old sales territory. And then after a few years, a job came open with Stauffer Chemicals, who was a basic manufacturer of herbicides mainly for corn and beans. And I applied for that job, and that was for basically Canada as a district manager. I enjoyed that job very much because we ended up putting together a team of people, both on the technical side, doing research and plots and trials, over to the sales and marketing side, where you got basically the whole operation of a company to look after. And that was a lot of fun. We had about 20 people at our peak. And then, of course, Stauffer got bought by a company called Unilever, who was in the cosmetic business. And that got bought again by Cheeseboro Ponds, another company in the cosmetic business. And then that got bought out by a company called ICI, which had bought out Chipman Chemicals, which was actually our distributor for Stauffer Chemicals in Canada. So our distributor ended up buying us as a manufacturer in an indirect route after about 4 or 5 transitions.
Right.
Yeah.
So that obviously, when that happened, that was you had to sell the farm, right? So talk about that transition, not just from a career perspective, but a lot of things happening at once, right? New job, moving off a gravel road for the first time in many years, and what, and then maybe what opportunities came from that.
Well, that brought us to a fulcrum point, and probably the toughest decision we ever had to make in our lives, and that was leaving the farm, because at that point we were offered a job by the new company to move to Stony Creek, or the other option was to take a package and stay on the farm. And you know, at that time in agriculture, it was fairly depressed era in terms of prices.
It was the 80s, right? It was the end of the 80s, which was not a good time. Yeah.
I remember selling corn, and it's just hard to believe now. The market at the harvest time in about, I'm going to say mid 80s, was $1 a bushel compared to $9 today. So it's quite a different era. And we had taken on, our little hobby farm had grown from 100 acres that it started off. And all of a sudden we were farming 1,000 acres. We did not own 1,000 acres. We owned about 400, but we did custom work and rented the additional. And we had a couple hundred beef cattle. So it was quite a family operation. And all our children were heavily involved with it, and including my father. And, you know, there was a lot of work to be done. But the bottom line was we also carried a lot of debt. And could we really carry that debt without the income off farm? And the answer was maybe. And then the other side of that was, well, our kids are all leaving. One's already gone to Australia, our oldest one, Stephen. He's gone on an egg exchange to Australia. And you were just about to go, you were in grade 11 in high school, so you weren't too long going to be around. And Laurie, our daughter, had already gone to University of Guelph. So pretty soon we were going to be by ourselves, trying to run the operation that we couldn't run by ourselves. So the decision was a tough one, but we decided, okay, we'll exit farming and we'll carry on with the career off farm.
Mm-hmm.
I don't today know whether it was the right one or the wrong one. You look at the real estate values today, as far as agriculture, with $30,000, $40,000 an acre land, you'd say it's the wrong one. But if you look at, well, could you survive for the next 10 years without that off-farm income? And the answer, we don't know.
Right. Right. No, and it probably, I would say, led into the other opportunities, right? From going to Stony Creek, that's, I think, where you bridged over into the seed industry, right? It was obviously finishing up there, things there from a crop protection perspective, but then that afforded you another opportunity in the seed industry. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, it was interesting that the crop protection industry, when you got into the late 80s, was really starting to mature. I mean, there had been a deluge of new products coming on in the 70s and 80s. And then it was getting to the point where they were doing combinations of products that were already existing chemistry, just to come up with new mixes, but put a new name on it for marketing purposes. And one of my jobs with Pfizer Chemicals over the years had been a sales territory manager for seed and chemicals, because they had a line of Trojan seeds out of the US, and I had a district sales job for 3 years with them. And I was managing a farm dealer network selling seeds and a legitimate retail outlet selling chemicals. So I got to learn both sides of the business during that 3 years. The other side of that was with our own farming operation. You learn the practical side of the seed business.
Yep.
You know, how to plant it, all the agronomic things you need to know about it that you can't learn in a textbook, really.
Yep.
And so I had that basic experience. So then all of a sudden, when I was working with ICI Chipman, I found out that they had a seed operation and they owned a business called Garst Chemicals in the USA. And they were doing fairly well in the USA, but they really had no distribution system in Canada outside of the co-ops in Ontario and Quebec. And I had a discussion with the folks down in the US with Garst to see if they're interested in doing anything in Canada in terms of expanding that business. And they said, yes, we would, but we don't know anybody that'll do that for us. And I said, well, I would offer to do it for you. And so I presented that case to the management at Stony Creek and ended up taking on the development of and the expansion of the dealer network for Garst Seeds in Canada, and ended up working with a group out of Winnipeg because they ran the seed business in Canada called Advanta Seeds, or Garst as well. And so I was back in the seed business for about 3 or 4 years. And I thoroughly enjoyed it because the difference is at that time, the chemical business was becoming one of the distribution system had sorted itself out, and it was predominantly through legitimate retail outlets, farm supply outlets as we know them, that are in the fertilizer business. And most of your business was done at the head office level or at that retail point. The farm dealer network was gone as far as the crop protection chemicals. And so you were calling on a whole different client base. You really had lost touch with the farmer or the market. Back in the seed business, your contact point was the farmer still and farmer dealers. And there's no more fun in the ag business than working with farmers and farm dealers. They're great people to work with. They're earthy people. And you can talk to them on their level, particularly when you know their business and know how they're doing things. And it was really fun to get back to the grassroots part of the business. So that's how I reacquainted myself with the seed business and did that for about 4 years and then moved on from there.
Well, the move on from there, again, if you go back to was it a right decision to move off the farm? Because then the seed industry parlayed into a real right turn, I guess, to end your career in going to China. So talk a little bit about how that happened and a little bit about your experience there. That could be a whole podcast on its own, but talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the China opportunity came right out of left field. I had known a person that I'd worked with, actually with Pfizer Chemicals, that had gone to China, and I had lost touch with him until I saw him at a Canadian Seed Trade Association meeting. And he came up to me because he was in China at the time, and he said, I've been in China for 3 years and working in the cottonseed business for Delta and Pineland. And I'm about to leave and we need to hire a replacement. Are you interested? And I said, no, I have absolutely no interest in ever traveling to China. And that was the end of that part of the discussion. Anyway, he kept bugging me for 2 or 3 more days while we're at the convention. And by the end of the convention and a couple of dinners, he convinced me to go for an interview down to Nashville to meet the president of the company who was there at a convention. So it was August 1st weekend in 1998, I believe.
Yep.
And I went down for the interview in Nashville and really not thinking anything was going to happen of it, but I hadn't been in Nashville for a long time. So it'd be a nice weekend in Nashville. And before I left there, he offered me the job to manage the cotton business in China. And I said to the president who offered me the job, I said, I don't understand why you're offering me the job. I've never been in a cotton field in my life. I know absolutely nothing about cotton. I know nothing about China, never been there, can't speak the language. Why would you hire me? His answer was, you know the seed business. You obviously have people skills. You're a Canadian and you grew up on a farm, so you obviously know how to work. That was his answer. Then I thought, well, how am I going to present this to my wife and family? So I go home and lo and behold, my wife had a visitor that weekend because she ran a bed and breakfast in St. Mary's. And he was from the US and he was the manager of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And he had been in China numerous times. And he asked, where's your husband? And she said, well, he's away. And she reluctantly didn't want to talk much about where I was going. She hadn't told anybody, or we hadn't told anybody what was going on as far as maybe an opportunity. And finally, she told him, well, he's actually at an interview to go to China. And he said to her, if you get the opportunity to go to China, don't you ever turn it down. It's the most fantastic place you'll ever want to go. So she was convinced before I even got home.
Job done.
Oh, then eventually, after a lot of discussion and head scratching, and we were at the stage in life where our family was all grown up, and you were about to get married and move on. So the house is empty. So we decided, well, maybe the old folks could take another turn in life and seize this opportunity one last time. Yep. And we've never been to Asia, so let's go for it. And we did. And it was a wonderful experience.
Yes. And what would you say, maybe touch on one or two of the stories there, individual stories? I know there are many, but even your advice to those that go over now to participate in the banquets, the famous banquets there.
China is a banquet wonderland. You can't do, well, first of all, when you go to China to do business, you throw everything out the window that you've learned in terms of how to do business in North America, because it doesn't work in Asia. In Asia, you have to build a relationship for many, many months before you can even attempt to present your real business opportunity and move on from there. And the only way you build a relationship is by going to many, many banquets. And I decided fairly early on after being there, if I didn't learn some sort of defense strategy for the banquet culture, I wouldn't be alive very long and my liver would be gone as well, because banquets require a lot of heavy drinking of what they call as their national liquor, which is baijiu. And it's made out of sorghum, and it's somewhere between 40 and 70% alcohol. They drink it straight in shot glasses. And every banquet you go to, everybody has to toast you, particularly as a foreign guest. And pretty soon, if you're not careful, you could drink 20 or 30 ounces of 40 or 50 or 60% alcohol at one banquet. And I saw many people carried out of the room as a result. So I decided that, okay, how am I going to handle this? So every banquet has a teacup, and they always have green tea, and there's always a waitress circling the table, making sure your teacup is full. And so what I would do is I drink my teacup down fairly quickly, and then I found out I could hold about 2 shots of baijiu on my jowls, and then I take a sip of tea and dribble it back into the teacup, and then I'd say to the waitress, take that teacup away, and she'd bring me a new one, and I'd drink that one down very quickly, and then I'd have an empty teacup to work with again. And I would say of all the times I was in China at all these banquets, I probably never drank more than 2 or 3 shots of their foreign liquor because of that strategy. And that saved my liver and saved my health.
Sometimes it's the little strategies that work, right? I think I participated in a banquet and didn't know that lesson yet, and I was worse for wear for it. Yes, for sure. So then what have you been up to? Obviously, since China, you came back and I think you had a bridge year. You still were with the company back in Ontario, helping them as far as transitioning to the next new person. And then so tell us a little bit about that and then what you've been up to since.
Yeah, when I again, when I decided to resign my position and retire, which was, can't remember what year it was now. I think it was 2004. And I had found a replacement, but he was still in training. And we managed to do the training in Canada for about a 3-month period because SARS came along. And so nobody could travel back and forth to China. So we did the training in Canada. And during that period, I was chairman of the board for 2 companies in China. We had developed 2 joint ventures while I was there, producing and selling BT cotton. It's the same technology as they had in Canada for BT corn. And we were partnered with Monsanto as far as the technology was concerned, and Delta and Pineland provided all the seed technology. Anyway, so I stayed on as a consultant for about a 2-year period during that transition. And I made a graceful exit, and it all worked out fairly well. And then about a year later, of course, Monsanto bought Delta and Pineland, and that was the end of that scenario. And so hence another merger took place. And eventually, the joint ventures that we developed were shut down because Monsanto took them over. The Chinese had stolen all the technology and put it into their seed products, and no one would ever know we were there.
So what do you do to keep busy these days?
Well, then you look for something to do in retirement. And when you get to my ripe old age, you decide that you've led a privileged life because you never had to go to war. You never went hungry. And there's a lot of people in the world in a lot worse shape than you are. And you decide it's about time to give back something. And so you get involved with community service work. I've been a member of the Rotary Club for about 25 years here in St. Mary's. Gotten involved with a lot of different projects, trying to do some good for other people in other parts of the world and locally as well. It's been a wonderful experience.